I have the wonderful pleasure to welcome and to introduce Vivian Dittmar. Vivian has been a passionate explorer of consciousness and culture since a very young age. Born in Germany, Vivian grew up in Europe, Asia, and North America. She founded the non-profit Be the Change Foundation and is driving force for cultural change. As the author of The Power of Feelings and 6 other books, she has become a sought-after expert and keynote speaker on the subject of emotional and social intelligence. Today she's going to talk to us about conflict as a gateway to a new consciousness. Vivian, can I invite you up, please? Let's give her a good hand. Thank you. Let me too.
Okay. So it's a great pleasure to be here finally. It's my 3rd attempt. For probably many of us, it's the 3rd attempt, right? To finally come here. And I'm really moved to speak on the subject of conflict in this context. I've been working with conflict for many years, working with emotions and working with relationships. You kind of have to eventually deal with conflict. And now with what is happening in the world, all my thinking and all my work, all my feeling around conflict has kind of come to a reckoning. I think for many of us, right? We've come to a kind of reckoning. And so it's, it is for me very powerful to share my thinking with you on the subject of conflict in this context. In my exploration of conflict, I came to realize that conflict can be a gateway to a new consciousness. And I emphasize can be, meaning it's a possibility. And as we all know, very often we don't seize that opportunity. Very often we fail to seize the opportunity that conflict provides us with, that conflict actually invites us into. And the reason why we fail is because we do not yet have the consciousness that conflict invites us to develop. So it's kind of like a catch-22 situation. How do we develop the consciousness to embrace consciousness in such a way that it can be a gateway to a new consciousness? And that's what I want to talk about. And one of the things that really surprised me in my work with conflict and my exploration of conflict is that I really fell in love with conflict. And that was very surprising for me because, like many of us, I used to avoid conflict at all costs. Conflict was something I was very, very afraid of. Anybody know that? Yeah. So we have very good reasons to be afraid of conflict. If we look back at our history, conflict has been equated with violence and war for millennia. So we all carry personal and collective trauma that in our system, consciously, subconsciously, personally, and collectively, we carry a deep knowing that conflict is dangerous. And this experiential knowing prevents us from actually meeting conflict. So in my experience, most people, including myself, will avoid conflict as long as they can because we equate it with violence and war. And for me, it was very important to realize that there are 2 different things. That violence and war are not the same thing as conflict. Violence and war are a symptom that we are unable to deal with conflict, that we're unable to be with conflict, that we're unable to embrace conflict. So for me, that was important because I've personally, in this lifetime, experienced violence. And I've experienced how overwhelming that can be and how helpless that makes us. And I've personally experienced how useless it is in that context to be told that, well, it always takes two, you have to see both sides, etc., etc. After deep reflection, I've personally come to the conclusion that the saying, it always takes two for a fight, is not true. It's a myth. It's a cultural myth, and it's very powerful because it makes possibly someone responsible for an act of aggression that they're not actually performing. So what is true, however, is that it always takes two for peace. It always takes two to make a relationship work. And this is something that we're now collectively waking up to. And it's a very painful waking up, because it was very comfortable, in a way, to be in that bubble of saying, well, as long as I'm nice to everyone, and I take care of my shadow, and I do my spiritual work, and do my nonviolent communication, etc., nothing bad will happen to me, because it always takes two, right? You see, there's like a naivete in that bubble, and a comfort also, that I got to experience as a young woman, that that's not true. And that when we're dealing with violence and aggression, we need to have ways to stop the violence before we can open the vulnerable spaces that we definitely need for healing, for connection, for conflict to be something beautiful, which is what I've discovered. Conflict can be amazing, and I'll get into that in a moment. But in order for conflict to reveal its potential, we need to have spaces that are safe for vulnerability. And those are spaces that are protected from the use of violence. So, what happens for many of us when we're confronted with conflict is that we immediately, and this goes for any kind of conflict, it can be a really small conflict, that we immediately shift into a mentality of war. And this very often doesn't happen consciously. Usually it doesn't happen consciously. It's something where all our trauma memory and all our nervous system goes into a kind of a different mode, and it's the war mode. And in this war mode, our consciousness functions very differently. We go into a survival mode, we go into a mode of separation, we go into a consciousness of us or them, me or you. We go into a consciousness of othering, and we become completely identified with our own position, our own perspective. We believe we're absolutely right. We deeply feel we're absolutely right. And the other becomes the enemy. And what is so tragic is that this happens not only in situations of war and violence. It happens in love relationships. It happens in our relationships with those who are closest to our hearts. And that's what baffles me. And one of the things that I'm working with is that, okay, if we cannot even have peace in our love relationships, how in the world are we supposed to have peace with those who are so far from us, who are so different from us? And one of the beauties, obviously, of a holistic or integral perspective is that we know that learning this in our love relationships, in our closest relationships, will enable us to build a consciousness that is strong enough so we will one day be able to do it on a large scale with all our differences on this amazing planet. But let's start with square one. Let's start with where so many of us still fail despite all our work, which is to resist the mentality of war, to become aware of it first of all, and then learn to shift out of it. And learn to embrace conflict as a gateway. Because conflict, like I said, is not war, is not violence. Conflict is a very natural phenomenon of life. Conflict will accompany us for the rest of our lives. As long as there is life, there will be conflict. And I feel it's very important to acknowledge this, because especially in the spiritual world, we can then go into this other level where it's like everything is one, everything is love, everything is light, everything is unity, everything is peace. And we try to avoid the reality that life is conflict, because life is diversity. And through conflict, there is tension, and there is movement, and there's development, and there's creativity. That's what conflict is. So there's a great beauty in that. So I said I fell in love with conflict, and what I actually fell in love with is the gap. And the gap is something that reveals itself to us only when we change perspective. So what happens usually when we're in a conflict, like I said before, we're fully identified with our position. We only see our position, and we're unable and mostly also unwilling to see the position of the other person, because we know they're wrong. So why bother? And it takes a change of perspective, which I've tried to illustrate here, where we start to see the conflict from the side. So we change the perspective to this. And I don't know if it's something you want to try for a moment. Try this movement. Like put your hand here and the second hand here. So this is like your enemy, and that's your perspective. And just try for a moment to do this movement and change the perspective. So what happens when we change the perspective? We also change how we're using our brain. And we're moving from a single-pointed enemy, me against you perspective to a systemic, holistic, spatial perception. And I highly recommend that you do this when you're in a conflict. And I actually recommend that you do this when you're in a very small conflict, because then it's easier. Start with the small conflicts and then work your way to the really big conflicts. Okay, don't start with the biggest conflict, you're going to fail. So start with a small conflict, and you can take 2 dolls or 2 chairs or 2 friends and do this. Really change perspective and look at it from the side. Physically look at it from the side. And what happens is then you're actually, once you've done that, you're looking at a system. And you're able to perceive the conflict as a system. And what you have when you have a conflict, which, by the way, my definition of conflict is always this person wants something else than this person, and they don't match. Yeah, that's a very simple definition. What we have between the two is a void, a gap, a space. And that's what I fell in love with. This space between what you want and what I want. the space where we don't know. Because this space is rife with possibility. This space, if we're really willing to embrace this space, to go into this space together, we don't know what's going to happen. But it's going to be new. It's going to be new. Something new will emerge from this space. And this is possible only if both parties are willing to not use violence. We need a space where we can hold that tension and be with that tension. As long as we're beating each other up, we can't hold that space. We can't hold that tension, which is pure potential. So when I say I fell in love with conflict, I fell in love with conflict with people who are able and willing to not resort to violence and force to resolve the conflict. And that's a big if. Because, of course, none of my friends are going to beat me up if we disagree. But there's much more subtle ways of arguing, of telling me why I'm wrong and why they have the right and I don't, and da-dee-da-da-da-da-da-da. We all know that, right? But when you have someone, whether that's a partner or a friend or a colleague, who is willing to go with you to that place of not knowing and to stay, to hold their own place and to see your place, then you can enter here. And then it becomes a gate. It becomes a gate to something new. And you don't know what will emerge. You don't know whether you will get your needs met or the other person will get their needs met. You don't know if your solution will be the one that you're going to work out or theirs. Most likely, you're going to come up with something completely new that's much better than what either of you had thought about before. That's my experience. Now, the problem is that this gate, initially, is locked. So just changing perspective is not enough, because of all the trauma we bring. So the question is, what blocks the gate and how can we unlock it? First of all, there's mental blocks to the gate. One of them is the habit of asking closed questions. So, you're going to commit to a monogamous relationship with me, yes or no? You're going to have a child with me, yes or no? You know, we don't need to talk about this. Yes or no? If it's no, I'm out. Yeah, closed questions. Absolutes. Absolutes is my expression for whenever we feel we're absolutely right about something. We don't feel that we know that. Yeah, and we have holy scriptures, and we have laws, and we have God knows what to prove that we're absolutely right. And the other is opinions. We have opinions about all sorts of things, and they keep the gate locked because they clash. And you have your opinion, I have mine, and we can argue forever about which opinion is legitimate. And it's going to keep us from entering into that space of the unknown, which is so fascinating. So that's what locks the gate mentally. But what most people are even more challenged with is that the gate is locked emotionally. And the symptoms of emotional blockage of the gate are drama, very often present in conflict. We go into huge dramas when there's conflict. Numbness means we don't feel anything. We're unable to really resonate with the space and thereby unable to embrace it. There's tension and tightness. So this feeling you can't breathe. Yeah. And all of this is symptoms of what I call emotions. And emotions, I use the term very specifically, as some of you might know, I use that for emotional baggage. So your old stuff that gets activated in conflict personal and collective stuff. And as I mentioned in the beginning, with conflict, we have a lot of collective baggage that gets activated. This afternoon, 6 p.m., I'm going to do a workshop on how to deal with this. Yeah, because I can talk a lot about it, it's not going to help you. We need to go there. So that's what we're doing later. But now let's look at how the gate opens. So at the mental level, instead of asking closed questions, we need to shift to open questions. Hey, what do we do with this issue that I really want to have a monogamous relationship and you don't? That's an open question. We move from talking about absolutes to needs. What are your needs? What are my needs? So we move to a place of vulnerability. And rather than talking about, oops, what happened here? Sorry. Okay. Rather than talking about opinions, we talk about perspectives. What is your perspective and what is my perspective? So let's see, I need to get back to where I was. Okay. Yeah, and then on the emotional level, what happens when we clean the space emotionally, and like I said, we're going to do that later, is that there's a shift. And emotions become feelings. Some of you might be familiar with my book, The Power of Feelings, where I talk about the positive expression of anger, sadness, fear, etc. So all those feelings will still be there, but in a positive expression. The drama becomes adventure. Sometimes people ask me, isn't it super boring to have such a harmonious relationship? It's like, you have no idea. I have no idea what my partner is going to come up with next. And I know we're not going to resort to fighting or violence, but hey, the space of the unknown is super exciting. So there's enough excitement in my life, trust me. So instead of numbness, we go into equanimity, the ability to just be with the tension and the differences. And the tension becomes relaxation. So we learn to relax into the tension. And that's an amazing process that I can just mention, and you can take it with you. You like explore it. It's amazing. It's beautiful. And the tightness becomes space. Good. So last slide. So we go from the old to the new paradigm through the gate. So this is the gate. You see it from up. And the old paradigm, we have like violence, win-lose, discussion, dominance, how do I get my needs met, competition. And the new, we have creativity, how do we get our needs met, win-win, dialogue, respect, and cooperation, all that good stuff that we're working on. Now, what we need to understand when you're looking at the gate, you can open your side by working on your mental and emotional levels. And you need to, it opens to your side, so you need to actually step back in order to do that. Then you can sneak on through to the other side, and you can help the other person unlock theirs. See, there's a little handle from the other side. But you can only do that once you've done your own homework. This is very important, because people so often ask me, yeah, I know all that, but how can I help the other person? Well, if you're really in the other space, you know. Yeah? And then what we do, how can we assist others? Violence needs boundaries. Emotions need compassion. And absolutes need a sincere interest in the other person's needs. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.